Okay, so this video is going to be on the second half of chapter 2, and I also have my little stuffed peacock here because she's so cute. Her name is Priscilla. We're just like two Priscillas vibing. I love her. So in the first half of the chapter, Dolmage went through the retrofit and its implications and drawbacks, defeat devices, and went a little bit into accommodations, which he gets into more in the second half of this chapter, and more specifically in this next subsection, which is called the Affect of Accommodation. And here, Dolmage goes through university learning assistance offices and centers, and how they're first and foremost concerned with enforcing the reasonable accommodations mandated by the ADA or other laws. He explains that another entailment of the accommodation model is the idea that it is the student themselves who must prove that they need accommodations and must argue for them reasonably. And so he references Joe Stramondo, who writes that using medical experts as the gatekeepers is a way to avoid fraud, but this amounts to a disincentive for an already marginalized group to claim what is theirs. In effect, through their medicalization, the reasonable accommodations that the ADA have, at least partially, become barriers to the inclusion of disabled people in the academy. Dolmage explains that there's a clear rhetoric in accommodation discourse as well, an attitude of indifference towards the individual, and a refusal to provide support until this support is legally mandated. And so following this process, the accommodations offered still demand that the student must accommodate themselves to the dominant logic of classroom pedagogy. He explains that once we begin to go down the road of accommodating disability, we're also admitting that dominant pedagogies privilege those who can most easily ignore their bodies and those whose minds work most like the minds of their teachers. And so he says that the key word of the retrofit and key goal for accommodation and accessibility, as he said before, is compliance. When talking about the effects of this, he references Stephen Cuisto, who argues that the focus on compliance turns the request for accommodations into an invitation for gestural violence. So gestural violence is tied into dominance and refers to the threat of violence in the academic workplace through things like annoyance at requests for accommodations. And so what happens in the academy whenever a disabled employee or student asks for an accommodation that the school doesn't know how to deliver or fears will be expensive, and it's always the first response when non-disabled administrators or faculty are faced with bewildering disability-related challenges, it works by deflection and assumptions. Dolmage explains that another response comes from teachers who find or invent an extreme example of a disabled student's demands and then proceed to debate the validity of a student's claim to disability. So here, students with learning disabilities come to be seen as being given an unfair advantage over other students. He says that on the other extreme, accommodation is often seen as an act of charity, and so accommodation requests thus get the tone police treatment, where students are encouraged to perform the role of gracious, thankful subject, to praise good professors and administrators, and to never complain. He explains that there's no feedback loop. If an accommodation is given, the student is expected to be fully thankful and happy, regardless of the fit of the accommodation or its efficacy. Students have to feel and act fully accommodated at all times, even when they're not. So there's a variety of potential results that Dolmage brings up. So the student becomes the object of the medical gaze and hence the object of therapeutic and corrective pedagogy. The student evades this process and remains invisible. The student is seen as flouting disability instead of pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. Their needs are deflected and defeated. The Academy makes a limited range of accommodations its moral mission, making students with disabilities the object of pity. So with only these possibilities, and with these possibilities reinforcing one another, students with disabilities face a very difficult environment. Dolmage then brings up the research of Barber, Fendley, and Hamill, who've examined the rhetoric of accommodation and sort through a history of disciplinary attitudes towards learning disabilities. They advocate for what they call underground accommodations through a program of alternative assistance. And so a program like this mitigates some of the stigma by allowing students to access accommodations somewhat secretly, in concert with teachers and disability services offices. And so the program also extends across a student's university career so that accommodations aren't just temporary patches over pedagogy. However, nothing is done to confront stigmatization as a cultural problem, and so the message is that disability should be secret, it must sink below the mainstream, and surface pedagogy must not be disturbed, and disability is then presented as an alternative to classroom culture. He explains that they don't mention that this type of program, through the Strategic Alternative Learning Technology Center at the University of Arizona, costs students a little over $2,000 per semester on top of the cost of securing documentation of their disability and regular tuition costs. So this reveals another problem, which is that being non-normal costs the individual. And Dolmage explains that across North America, many schools want to dissuade students with disabilities from applying and enrolling because it's believed that their needs cost more and it's perceived as a drain on university resources. So Dolmage explains the issue here. All other students cost money to educate as well, and they also pay tuition, but students with disabilities are generally the only ones who are uniquely constructed economically as costing too much. So other students are seen as investments to be protected, but campus policies are generally designed to protect the university from disabled students, construing them as physical threats, threats to the intellectual freedom of educators, lawsuit threats, and as always already cheating the system somehow. He finally talks about the way that academia is run as a business and how the concern with retention rates as a result of this business model leads them to try to kick out disabled individuals before they can impact these rates. He references Pegan Powell, who states that retention efforts are a kind of retrofit that, like basic writing courses or ramps for people with physical disabilities, treat failure as the problem of the individual rather than that of the institution. So this is just one of the byproducts of the good business of academic administration. He goes through Vasey's two types of academics. There's those who insulate themselves from the public and students in order to perform research, and there's administrators who know how to run and talk about higher education as a business with American values. He suggests that academics have a managerial unconscious, one that syncs up with the demand for white-collar workers, so whether unconsciously implanted in the minds of academic administrators or overt in the words and deeds of the chief executive officer administrators that are imported into academia, this business model has specifically dangerous ways to respond to and to construct disability. He closes off the section stating that as more colleges and universities are run like businesses, and as governments continue to defund schools so that they need to rely more and more on private funding, which increases this orientation to a business model, we can expect that disability will continue to be constructed as a drain, a threat, not worth retaining, and something to be eradicated or erased. The next section is called From Eradication to Negotiation, and here Dolmage reiterates that the normative demand in academia is that disability must disappear, something which the accommodation rhetoric echoes. He states that a disability studies perspective asks us to think about how what we do enables and disables once we allow disability to even exist in the first place. Inclusion should mean the presence of significant difference that rhetorically constructs, though often people with disabilities have such change agency qualified or revoked. He explains that inclusion might be used as a panacea, a word that might register the presence of difference while keeping its participation delayed. He references Patricia Dunn, who argues that total immersion in the mainstream for students with disabilities, while not altering the mainstream, will not work. He then brings up Cynthia Lewicki-Wilson's suggestion, which is that people with disabilities often find themselves arguing or being pushed towards the argument, we just want to be treated like everyone else, thereby diluting the transformative potential of their participation in the public forum. He concludes that the perspective of disability, then, shouldn't just be included in the classroom, shouldn't just be reflected in the design of our teaching practices and technologies, but must change what we do. He suggests that in some cases, a retrofitting can be useful, can aid students in the navigation of the space, but we need a more sophisticated form of negotiation in order to retrofit structures and practices in the best possible way. We need to think through the academic spaces that we inhabit and build, and the bodies that are written into, ruled by, and rewrite these spaces. He explains that with the negative attitudes towards disability that were covered in the previous parts of this chapter and book, negotiation is rarely evident. Instead, people with and without disabilities are forced to work around an inaccessible environment, never cooperating because too often their concerns are perceived as divergent or in competition. He reiterates his point that we need to allow for an environment in which students can claim difference without fear of discrimination, and adds on that this must be an environment which includes disability. Further, he explains that disability cannot be seen as something one person diagnoses in another. It has to be seen as socially negotiated, and people with disabilities must be seen as the moderators, the agents of this negotiation. He closes this section by highlighting the importance of the negotiative role for people with disabilities, and he references John Dewey, who writes, "The principle of interaction makes it clear that failure of adaptation of material to needs and capacities of individuals may cause an experience to be non-educative quite as much as a failure of an individual to adapt himself to the material." So for Dewey, this represents a failure in education, a failure to learn one of the most important lessons of life, that of mutual accommodation and adaptation. So Dewey thought that this adaptation should be ongoing. When he wrote about key concepts of education in the 1930s, he suggested that there could be no set materials and methods. Instead of viewing set approaches to set groups of students as intentional and rational, he foregrounded the role of changing environments, the context of a community, the wide diversity of learners, and argued that lack of mutual accommodation makes the process of teaching and learning accidental. Like, I would hope that we're creating such an environment where learning isn't just something that happens accidentally, like by chance, that it's like an intentional thing. Dolmage acknowledges that Dewey's position is difficult to argue for today in an era of standardized testing and a no child left behind curriculum, because the position that intentional, clinical, standardized education would be only accidentally successful and that only co-intentional and situated education could be malleable enough for success is just an argument that's hard to make right now. However, he says that without something like this shift, we're going to continue to have accidental success for some students, which is anchored in the structural exclusion of others, and this structural exclusion will be abetted and allowed by forms of temporary, tokenized, and tenuous inclusion. The next section is called Digital Curb Cuts to Nowhere, and here Dolmage explains that one of the most prominent examples of the retrofit has always been the curb cut, which are those dips incorporated or cut into sidewalks so that wheelchairs can roll up rather than needing to be lifted over the little lip of the sidewalk. And so he goes through a long list of technologies that were originally developed for people with disabilities but now benefit all, explaining that disability has played a crucial yet overlooked role in the development of technology, and that all technology really is assistive technology. That being said, he explains that once many of these technologies are championed as being good for all, or once the advocacy and politicized arguments that drove the creation of these technologies has drifted away, the same innovations can lose their efficacy. So he says that this idea of an accommodation not cutting it might lead us to memes of curb cuts to nowhere, which are images posted online of ramps and curb cuts that literally lead nowhere and just have been memeified. He takes one example where a curb cut for wheelchair users literally just leads to a set of steps, and so the commentary on this by Accessibility New Zealand is that it almost seems to be a case of, let's put a curb cut because the regulations call for them, which is a prime example of mindless application of the standards with little or no thinking. And so he then gives a series of examples with things like screen readers, alternative texts, and audio descriptions of films, which are just as useful and thoughtless as the curb cut to the stairs. He notes that the curb cut to nowhere images have commonly been posted as a form of backlash against accommodations, the message being, look how silly this fad of architectural correctness is. Yet the images also accurately reflect an absurdist critique of the retrofitting industry, showing how most accessible design is facile if it's satisfied with simply looking like it's addressing an inequity. The accessibility fix is unsatisfactory, clashes with the other messages of the space, and in fact ruins or invalidates the architectural character of the building. He explains that disability itself is clearly misfit by the ableist or normate template that the campus was built upon, and so the same thing happens with alternative text and with visual description in the examples that he gives above, which I didn't go into, but if you read the book you'll find them. So he says that we create digital curb cuts and ramps that lead nowhere just as readily as we create concrete ones. The next section is called #AcademicAbleism, where Dolmage explains that curb cuts to nowhere and other accessibility gone wrong memes can also become a way to circulate anti-ableist critique. So he suggests that retrofits, curb cuts, interest convergences, and other forces and structures that make the world an ableist landscape, digitally and concretely also provide us opportunities to mobilize and connect, often using digital tools. And so as an example, he refers to the AcademicAbleism hashtag that was created in 2014 and has created a network and community of students and faculty, exposing much of the hypocrisy around discrimination toward and debasement of disability within higher education. Going into accommodations, he explains that most students who seek them aren't allowed to know what the actual range of accommodations might be. They have to go into disability services, offer up their diagnosis, and have that diagnosis matched with a stock set of accommodations. He says that a student once summarized the accommodation process as being like the game Battleship. You can't perceive what's on the other side of the board because there's a barrier there, and so you just have to keep trying to guess where the other players' ships are or what the right accommodations are if they exist. You throw your diagnosis over and hope that it will land on something that will actually help you, but you can't sense the full range of what might be on the other side, and thus you can't directly ask for what you need. He connects this foregrounding of diagnosis to Ellen Samuel's idea of the biocertification of disability, a fantasy of identification that follows from a belief that something like disability is fixed and verifiable and scientifically visible. The fantasy also entails that disability is not verifiable in any other way. It's purely a biological fact, and it's viewed best, or perhaps only, by a medical professional. That being said, the fantasy also allows the scientific basis of disability to be bent towards other, more subjective language and processes. So long as the biocertification is foregrounded, the process can then devolve into something much less rigid. In practice, students might be asked by disability services to tell us what you need, and again, students have to guess. He states that we have a long way to go when the very simplest of classroom accommodations become standoffs with professors pitting their own academic freedom against the needs of their students, as though these two things cannot be simultaneously safeguarded and respected. He looks at it from another angle, explaining that at times, the metaphorical game of battleship is almost comically simple because offices of disability services offer a very narrow range of accommodations, and so this manifests in blanket or rubber stamp one-size-fits-all accommodations, and even these must be asked for over and over again by students who are forced to hold their hand out for something that we cannot even prove helps them. He says that as teachers, one way to diffuse this game is to work to expand the repertoire of accommodations. Every time you get an accommodation request, you honor that request, but you also implement another appropriate one, not just for that student, but for any student in a class like yours. And if the accommodation that gets suggested for a student in your class doesn't really fit your pedagogy, like if extended testing time is suggested but you don't give tests, then you suggest something else. He proposes another way to think about the retrofitted accommodation, which is to picture it as a game of whack-a-mole. That game, where it's like, there's like holes and then the thing pops up and then like the goal is to like whack it down into the hole and like to have no things popping up. That was a terrible explanation, but I hope you know what I mean. And so he explains that disability has become the whack-a-mole of higher education. When disability pops up, we slap it with a quick accommodation and we just hope it doesn't pop up again. So the nature of the retrofitted accommodation requires that we make no lasting changes to our pedagogy or to the culture of the university, we just whack it whenever it pops up. He then explains that if you walk into any faculty mailroom in the beginning of a semester, not having a letter from Disability Services is seen as a win, signaling that disability will not be a concern that semester. He explains that not having an envelope in your mailbox or an email encourages teachers to not import or carry forward past strategies they may have developed for accommodating students and to not develop new ones. And so the teacher then imagines an immediate future without disability, one that, very distressingly, feels like a relief to them. He says that at many schools now, the process of distributing the letters to the teachers has been outsourced to the student themselves as a gesture to a kind of self-efficacy that seems pedagogical and intentional. It's a paternalistic message to the student that they need to take control of their own accommodations, but the power differential between students and teachers is huge. He explains that if about 2/3 of US college students with disabilities won't disclose them to seek help, they certainly won't do so if this disclosure now gets forced and repeated at the beginning of every class. So in practice, self-advocacy is just another type of barrier, and disclosing disability is constructed as a confession of guilt and a submission to superiors. Dolmage explains that the envelopes involved in this process of seeking accommodations also envelops the student within them, foreclosing and sealing off other potentials and possibilities not related to the legalistic and medical discourse of the letter. Now, this doesn't have to be a bad thing. Disability identity should be an asset in many ways, but Dolmage argues that within a location steeped in academic ableism, it is a bad thing, because in such places, accommodations are much more likely to isolate demands for change within individual students, to take the form of defeat devices, and most notably, to stigmatize the student and the disability. So it's likely true that retrofits in other contexts can be much more useful and powerful than they can be in higher education, mainly because of the persistence of academic ableism. He states that when disability is seen as something suffered by a very few and otherwise invisible and non-present, then disability can never change the culture of higher education, and higher education will continue to wear out students with disabilities, to hold disability itself in abeyance, and to create access fatigue. He then asks the question, what if the college or university is the key space, the key economic mechanism, where disability is delayed, discouraged, and diverted from changing the world? And I mean, based on what we've seen through this book, that thought seems to be entirely plausible. When it comes to profs, Dolmage says that they're rendered complicit in the project of ableism and are betrayed by that complicity, and on the other hand, they're impacted by this academic ableism themselves in all of the ways that they're least able to diffuse its impacts. He explains that since ableism is the process by which academia reaches the pinnacle of its investments by eating itself, good teaching is never as simple as choosing what educational values you hold or convey, because the system is far too big for personal choice to cancel out the impact of ableism, and the processes by which students and teachers hold on within the system are very rarely the processes by which the system might be dismantled. He ends the section by stating that battling academic ableism will be as difficult, messy, ongoing, bottom up, and unpredictable as retrofitting is limited, bordered, constrained, top down, and rubber stamped. But that being said, while retrofits are something given to students to close down other possibilities, addressing academic ableism might be most effectively done by following students. In the last section, A Rights Demanding Bunch, Dolmage highlights the growing power of student protest through the example of a student at York University in Canada who won a human rights complaint against the school, resulting in students not needing to disclose what their diagnosis is in order to receive accommodations. In a Toronto Star article following this news, a columnist, Heather Malik, responded to these new documentation guidelines, kicking off the backlash by arguing that disabled students should be responsible for changing ableist culture by wearing their labeled diagnoses proudly and becoming advocates, and she also alluded to a rising tide of students with disabilities on campus. Her article basically went on to belittle and question diagnoses, providing perfect evidence that stigma still exists in society and that the stigma is particularly pronounced on our campuses, and showing exactly why students wouldn't want to wear their labeled diagnoses proudly, especially with highly stigmatized ones. Also, if we understand ableism as structural and we know that there's a power dynamic that exists where disabled students are oppressed within the structure of academia, how can we suggest that students should be responsible for changing ableist culture when they're denied access to the very things that would help them to do so? So Dolmage then refers to statistics which disprove Malik's idea that students seeking accommodations are a new fad or scam. He explains that in reality, many disabled students are not seeking accommodations at all, and goes through some of the things which may prevent disabled students from getting the supports they need and to which they have a right. So some of these reasons for not seeking accommodations may be the very stigma that Malik reinforces in her article, which begins with the idea that the university is the space for society's most able, physically, mentally, and otherwise, and it's not a place to admit to any weakness or challenge. Then there's also the quite reasonable feeling that you're going to be accused of faking it, even though the financial cost and labor involved in faking a disability would vastly outweigh any benefits. And then finally, the benefits are negligible. Note-taking and extra time or space for tests and exams can help, but the accommodations model too often assumes that learning only happens in lectures and high-stakes tests, and hasn't kept up with the modern classroom. Dolmage explains that in Canada, there are barely more than 200 professionals employed to provide disability accommodations at colleges and universities, so we can assume that the stigma increases and the provisions diminish further for Canada's nearly 200,000 graduate students. And so, for instance, recent research shows that half of Ontario universities do not even have an accommodation policy for these students. And so schools don't want more students who need accommodations, because then they would need to properly invest in support. And something I definitely want to look into in the future is just support and things like that for grad school stuff, like how disability services offices work at the post undergrad level. So yeah, chapter 2 is now done. There's going to be 5 more videos in this series, and I'll try to get those out as soon as possible. Before you go, look at her. We love her. Okay, bye!